Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
It was a crisp December evening in 1968, the kind that felt alive with the promise of the holidays. David Faraday, a bright-eyed 17-year-old, sat nervously in the driver's seat of his father's old Ford Mustang, its engine softly rumbling in the stillness of the night. He fidgeted with the rearview mirror, glancing back at his date, Betty Lou Jensen, who was adjusting her hair. At 16, she radiated a warmth that made David's heart race. Her laughter was a sweet melody, cutting through the chilly air as they discussed their plans for the night. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she teased, a playful smile dancing on her lips. "I mean, what if your parents find out?" "They won't," David replied, the confidence in his voice slightly masking the nervousness bubbling beneath. "We'll just be out for a little while. A drive, maybe some stargazing." He was excited. This was his chance to impress her. As they pulled away from the school parking lot, David couldn't help but feel a thrill of freedom. The road ahead twisted and turned, leading them into the secluded hills that surrounded their small town of Benicia, California. With the glow of the dashboard lights illuminating Betty's face, he felt a rush of hope. It was just the two of them, the world outside fading into darkness as they ventured deeper into the night. They parked at a quiet overlook, a spot where couples often went to share stolen moments under the stars. The view of the city lights glittered below, a sprawling sea of flickering jewels. David turned to Betty, his heart pounding as he leaned in for a kiss. Just as their lips met, a sudden rustle in the nearby bushes startled them. "Did you hear that?" Betty whispered, pulling back, her eyes wide with concern. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," David reassured her, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping into his mind. He laughed lightly, but it felt forced. The thrill of the night began to fray at the edges, and he felt a prickle of unease. Just then, a pair of headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating the trees behind them. A car approached, slowing down as it neared. David instinctively turned in his seat, hoping to catch a glimpse of who it was. But the car suddenly veered off the road, its headlights extinguishing as it disappeared into the brush. "What was that?" Betty asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just someone looking for a place to park," David replied, forcing a casual tone. But deep down, a sense of foreboding began to settle in his gut. Moments later, the tranquility of the night shattered like glass. David and Betty jumped as the sound of gunfire echoed through the air, sharp and jarring. They instinctively ducked, confusion and panic swirling within them. David's heart raced as he turned to Betty, whose face was pale with fear. "Get down!" he yelled, throwing himself over her as a second shot rang out, this one closer, more desperate. "David!" Betty screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. They scrambled out of the car, adrenaline surging as they dashed into the darkness. The night that had promised romance now felt suffocating, like a noose tightening around them. They heard footsteps, heavy and determined, echoing in the stillness behind them. "Keep running," David urged, pulling Betty along as they stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at their skin. Fear clawed at their throats as the reality of the situation sank in. Their carefree night had turned into a nightmare. They ran blindly, breathless and terrified, until they reached a clearing. David glanced back, his heart racing with terror. The figure was gaining on them, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. In a final desperate act, he turned to face their pursuer. "Stay behind me," he shouted, his voice barely masking the tremor of fear. Just then, the assailant raised the weapon, a gleaming .22 caliber pistol, and fired again. The shot rang out, striking David in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground with a painful thud. "David!" Betty cried, rushing to his side, panic washing over her. She could see the blood seeping through his shirt, bright and alarming. "Run, Betty! Just go!" he gasped, his breath hitching with pain. But she wouldn't leave him. With trembling hands, she tried to help him up, but the fear was paralyzing. They were both caught in a horrific moment, frozen between the instinct to survive and the bond they shared. Suddenly, the killer stepped into the light, a cold smile spreading across his face. David's blood ran cold as he realized the monster before them was not just a stranger, but a predator reveling in their fear. The world blurred into chaos. The last thing David saw was Betty's terrified face, her eyes wide with horror as the gun fired again. The crack of the gunshot echoed in his ears, mingling with the sounds of his heartbeat. Then, darkness enveloped him. Hours later, news of the horrific event spread through Benicia like wildfire. The small town, once peaceful and safe, was gripped by fear. Families huddled together, exchanging whispers of the tragedy that had unfolded that night. In the coming days, police flooded the area, canvassing for witnesses, but no one could provide a clear description of the killer. All they knew was that the shadow of the Zodiac Killer had begun to loom over the Bay Area, leaving a trail of horror and confusion in its wake. As the community mourned the loss of the young couple, the media swarmed in, eager to capture every detail. The story of David and Betty became sensationalized, turning them into tragic icons in a dark tale that gripped the nation. Their love story, once filled with hope and joy, now bore the mark of a gruesome crime, a symbol of innocence lost. In the shadows, the Zodiac Killer reveled in the chaos he had sown, sending letters to the local papers, taunting the police with cryptic messages. "This is the Zodiac speaking," he wrote, a chilling promise that echoed through the lives of everyone in the Bay Area. As the days turned into weeks, fear spread like a virus, infecting the minds of those who had once felt safe. The specter of the Zodiac Killer hung over the town, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. The atmosphere in Benicia was heavy with grief as the town gathered to mourn David and Betty. The community's shock transformed into anger and fear. Friends, family, and classmates filled the church for the wake, their faces etched with sorrow. Candles flickered in the dim light, casting shadows that danced along the walls like the ghosts of memories lost. Betty's parents stood at the front, their faces pale and drawn. They struggled to find solace in the outpouring of support. The once vibrant laughter of their daughter echoed in their minds, replaced now by a deafening silence. In the back of the church, a group of teenagers huddled together, their conversations hushed as they shared stories about the couple's laughter and love. Among them was Mark, David's best friend. The loss felt like a knife twisting in his gut. David had been more than a friend. He was a brother. The weight of the tragedy hung over him, suffocating his thoughts as he tried to grasp the reality of their friend's violent end. "I can't believe this is happening," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was just alive. We were just hanging out last week. It doesn't feel real," another friend replied, wiping away tears. "It's like we're living in a nightmare." As the service began, the eulogies poured forth. Stories of laughter, joy, and dreams cut short. But beneath the heartfelt tributes lay a rising tide of fear. Whispers of the Zodiac Killer spread among the mourners, an unseen monster lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. After the wake, Detective Jack Thompson stood outside the church, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had spent nearly 2 decades on the force, but nothing had prepared him for the brutality of this crime. The young couple's lives snuffed out in a matter of moments, and the killer remained at large. "Detective, any leads?" a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in his face. Thompson shook his head. "We're still gathering evidence. We have a lot of interviews to conduct." The press had descended on Venetia, turning the investigation into a media circus. The headlines screamed of the Zodiac Killer, amplifying the town's anxiety. Thompson knew they needed to act fast. With every passing hour, the fear of the unknown grew, tightening its grip on the community. He gathered his team in the station, a small room filled with the sound of scribbling pens and the rustle of papers. Maps of the area were pinned on the walls, marked with locations relevant to the case. The air was thick with determination and frustration. "All right, listen up," Thompson began, glancing at each member of his team. "We have a pattern emerging. This isn't just a random act of violence. The killer is methodical. We need to figure out who he is before he strikes again." As they delved into the details, they uncovered a disturbing trend. The Zodiac Killer had targeted young couples in isolated areas, striking with precision and ruthlessness. Each attack bore similarities to the murder of David and Betty, and the killer's taunting letters hinted at a game, one that he was winning. The first letter arrived at the Chronicle 2 weeks after the murders. It was postmarked from a nearby city, and Detective Thompson held it in his hand, feeling the chill of its contents. "Read this," he instructed his team, feeling the weight of the words settle over the room. The letter began with the now infamous line, "This is the Zodiac speaking," followed by a taunt about the recent killings. "I enjoy killing because man is the most dangerous game," Thompson read aloud, disgust curling his lip. "This guy is sick. He's relishing the fear he's created." The cryptic message contained a riddle, leading to a location in the Bay Area. Thompson knew they had to act quickly. This killer wanted attention, and the more they waited, the more powerful he became. The media was relentless, amplifying every detail of the investigation. They scrutinized the letters, the cryptograms, each word dissected and analyzed. The Zodiac seemed to revel in the chaos he caused, and Thompson felt the pressure mounting. With each day, the townspeople grew more restless, demanding answers. Fear consumed Venetia, transforming it into a town under siege. Residents locked their doors at night, peered out their windows at every sound, and avoided secluded places. The high school buzzed with whispered conversations, the once lively halls now haunted by a sense of dread. Mark and his friends began to distance themselves from each other, their bond strained by the shadow of fear. They had all known David and Betty, and the realization that anyone could be next loomed over them. They spent their days at school, but their minds were elsewhere, trapped in a cycle of anxiety. One afternoon, Mark found himself in the library, trying to focus on his homework, but unable to shake the feeling of unease. His eyes scanned the rows of books, but every shadow seemed to morph into a threat. He decided to talk to his history teacher, Mrs. Davidson, who had always been a source of comfort. "Mrs. Davidson, do you think we'll ever catch him?" he asked, his voice shaky. She looked at him, her expression serious. "I hope so, Mark. But we need to stay vigilant. It's important that we support each other and stay safe." That night, Mark lay in bed, haunted by images of David and Betty. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching into eternity. Sleep eluded him, replaced by the gnawing fear that the killer was still out there, watching and waiting. The investigation intensified as Thompson and his team raced against time. They followed leads that took them across the Bay Area, interviewing witnesses and examining every detail they could find. The Zodiac's taunts pushed them to their limits, but they refused to give up. One evening, while reviewing surveillance footage from a nearby gas station, they spotted a suspicious figure, a man in a dark jacket and cap, lingering in the shadows. Thompson felt a flicker of hope. This could be the break they needed. "Get a still frame of that guy and send it out," he ordered. "We need to find out who he is." Days turned into weeks, and the search continued. Each time they thought they were getting closer, the killer seemed to slip through their fingers. The letters continued to arrive, each more chilling than the last, taunting them with riddles and threats. "We need to get into the mind of this killer," Thompson said during a team meeting. "He's playing a game, and we need to be a step ahead." As they analyzed the letters, patterns began to emerge. The Zodiac was meticulous, leaving breadcrumbs for them to follow. But with each piece of the puzzle, the pressure mounted. The town's fear was palpable, and the detectives felt the weight of the community's expectations on their shoulders. One night, as Thompson pored over the case files in his office, a sudden idea struck him. He connected the dots between the locations of the murderers, the letters, and the neighborhoods surrounding them. He realized the Zodiac was likely living among them, observing his victims before striking. "Give me a list of registered sex offenders in the area," he instructed his team, urgency in his voice. "We need to interview them." As they followed up on leads, they received a tip about a man named Arthur Lee Allen. He had a history of violence and a pattern that matched the Zodiac's profile. Thompson felt a surge of adrenaline. This could be the break they'd been waiting for. They tracked down Allen, interviewing neighbors and delving into his past. With each revelation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But they needed more evidence. The letters weren't enough to make an arrest. The tension in Benicia escalated. Parents kept their children indoors, and couples avoided secluded areas. The fear was palpable, spreading like wildfire. Mark found himself in a constant state of anxiety, unable to escape the reality of the situation. One night, he and a few friends decided to take a drive to ease their minds. They ended up at the same overlook where David and Betty had last been seen. As they parked the car, Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Let's not talk about it," one friend suggested, but the silence was deafening. They sat in the dark, the weight of their thoughts heavy in the air. Suddenly, the sound of rustling bushes startled them. They turned, hearts pounding, as a figure emerged from the shadows. Panic surged through Mark's veins, memories of that night flooding back. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to sound brave, but his voice trembled. The figure stepped closer, and relief washed over him as he recognized one of their classmates. It's just me. I thought you guys were at the party. The tension broke, but the fear lingered. The town was a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The dark shadow of the Zodiac Killer loomed over them, reminding them that danger was never far away. As the investigation reached a fever pitch, Thompson knew they had to confront Allen. They had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to warrant a search of his home. The day arrived, and tension crackled in the air as Thompson and his team prepared to knock on Allen's door. Remember, we're here to gather evidence, not to confront him unless necessary, Thompson reminded his team. Stay calm and focused. As they approached the house, Mark stood outside the police station, watching the news. Reporters swarmed, and cameras flashed. The community held its breath, praying for a breakthrough. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Allen appeared disheveled, his demeanor erratic. As the detectives began their questioning, the air thickened with unease. Thompson noticed Allen's eyes darting around, as if searching for an escape. Arthur, we're here to ask you about the murders in Benicia, Thompson said, keeping his tone steady. What murders? Allen replied, his voice rising. You can't pin anything on me. As the questioning continued, Allen's facade began to crack. Thompson could sense the tension building. They needed a confession, but it wasn't coming easily. The dance of psychological warfare had begun. Hours passed, and Thompson felt the frustration mounting. Allen's behavior grew more erratic, and the detectives knew they were close to a breakthrough. Arthur, we have evidence linking you to the murders, Thompson said, his voice firm. It's only a matter of time before we find the truth. In that moment, something shifted in Allen's demeanor. The bravado faded, and a glimmer of fear replaced it. He realized the walls were closing in. The game was over. The revelation hit hard. Though they couldn't prove he was the Zodiac, the pressure had pushed him to the brink. Allen's confession hung in the air, a mix of relief and lingering dread. The fear that had gripped Benicia for so long began to lift, but the shadow of the Zodiac lingered in their hearts. As the dust settled, the community began to heal. Memorials sprung up in honor of David and Betty, reminding everyone of the lives lost. Mark and his friends slowly found solace in each other, united by their shared grief and resilience. Thompson stood at the overlook one last time, staring into the vast expanse of the Bay Area. He knew the fight against evil wasn't over. The Zodiac Killer may have been elusive, but they had come closer to understanding the darkness that lurked in their midst. The news of Arthur Allen's confession reverberated throughout Benicia, but the relief was overshadowed by the lingering fear that still clung to the air. Mark sat in his room, staring blankly at the wall, his mind racing with thoughts of David and Betty. The weight of grief and confusion pressed heavily upon him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror was not yet over. As the days turned into weeks, the community seemed to fracture. Conversations turned to whispers, and paranoia seeped into the lives of the townspeople. Some believed Allen was a scapegoat, while others feared the true Zodiac Killer remained at large, lurking in the shadows. The local coffee shop buzzed with tension, patrons casting wary glances at one another. One evening, Mark and Sarah sat at a booth in the dimly lit cafe, discussing the implications of Allen's confession. Do you really think he was just a pawn? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Mark replied, fidgeting with his coffee cup. But something doesn't sit right with me. How can someone just confess like that without any real evidence? Sarah looked out the window, where the fading light cast eerie shadows across the street. What if the real killer is still out there? What if he's watching us? Mark felt a chill run down his spine. We need to stay vigilant. We can't let fear control us. The local police were under immense pressure to close the case. Thompson and his team worked tirelessly, sifting through evidence and chasing leads. They pored over old case files, searching for connections that could link Allen to the Zodiac's past crimes. The pressure mounted, and the once close-knit community began to show signs of fracture. One rainy night, Thompson received a tip-off from an anonymous source. A woman claimed to have seen a man resembling Allen near the scene of one of the murders, lurking in the shadows just days before it occurred. The detectives had to follow up. They drove through the rain-soaked streets of Benicia, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The sound of raindrops tapping against the car created a rhythm of anxiety. This could be a game changer, Thompson said, his heart racing as they neared the woman's home. As they arrived, the woman opened the door cautiously, her face pale and drawn. I don't want to be involved, she said, her voice trembling. But I saw something. I need you to believe me. Thompson nodded, encouraging her to continue. Tell us what you saw. The woman recounted a night filled with dread. It was late, and I heard strange noises outside. I looked out the window and saw a man standing in the shadows. He had this look in his eyes. It was terrifying. I didn't recognize him, but I knew he didn't belong. The detectives pressed for details. Did you see where he went? I saw him walk towards the old quarry, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. There's an abandoned shack there. It's where? It's where people say the killer used to go. Thompson exchanged glances with his partner, Detective Sanchez. They needed to check it out, but a nagging doubt filled the air. As they drove toward the quarry, the weight of the night hung heavy around them. The rain had eased, but a thick fog rolled in, wrapping the landscape in a shroud of mystery. The path leading to the quarry was overgrown, branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to pull them into the darkness. Upon reaching the shack, Thompson felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The old structure creaked ominously as they stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Shadows danced along the walls, illuminated only by their flashlights. Stay close, Thompson instructed, his voice steady but filled with tension. They began to search the shack, looking for anything that could provide a clue. In a corner, they found a pile of discarded items, clothing, old photographs, and a journal. Thompson carefully picked up the journal, flipping through its pages. The writing was erratic, filled with ramblings about loneliness, darkness, and an obsession with power. His heart raced as he recognized the name scribbled in the margins. Arthur Allen. Look at this, Thompson said, showing Sanchez the journal. This could tie him to the past. But as they continued searching, they found something that sent chills down their spines. A blood-stained knife hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was clear they had stumbled upon something much darker than they anticipated. With the evidence in hand, Thompson and Sanchez rushed back to the station, their minds racing with the implications. They needed to analyze the knife and connect it to the murders, but the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Mark, still haunted by the events surrounding David and Betty, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He often walked alone at night, trying to find solace in the quiet streets of Benicia. But that night, something felt different. As he turned a corner, he noticed a figure in the distance, lurking under the dim streetlight. The figure appeared familiar, but as Mark approached, his heart sank. It was Arthur Allen. "Hey!" Mark shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. "What are you doing out here?" Allen turned, a twisted smile creeping across his face. "Just taking a stroll. You should join me. It's a beautiful night." Mark's instinct screamed for him to run, but he stood his ground. "Get away from me." As Allen stepped closer, Mark felt an icy grip of fear clutching his heart. He turned and sprinted down the street, the sound of Allen's laughter echoing in the darkness behind him. Thompson received a call from Mark just moments after the encounter. "I just saw him," Mark panted, his voice shaky. "He's out here, walking around like nothing happened." Thompson's blood ran cold. "Stay where you are. We're coming to get you." They raced through the streets, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The town that had once felt safe now seemed suffocated by shadows. As they arrived, they found Mark leaning against a lamppost, pale and trembling. "What happened?" Thompson asked, his voice urgent. "I saw him, and he just laughed," Mark stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "It was like he enjoyed it." Determined to put an end to the fear gripping their town, Thompson and Sanchez organized a search party. They couldn't afford to wait for the forensic results. They needed to find Allen before he could slip away again. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the streets, the atmosphere shifted. The once fearful community now felt a sense of unity, people banding together to protect their town. They spread out, scouring the alleyways and parks, searching for any sign of Allen. Hours passed, and exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but they pressed on. Finally, in a wooded area near the quarry, someone spotted a familiar figure. "There!" a voice shouted, pointing towards a shadowy outline darting through the trees. Thompson and Sanchez led the charge, adrenaline surging as they closed in on Allen. They could see him stumbling through the underbrush, his face wild with panic. "Arthur Allen!" Thompson shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness of the woods. "Stop right there!" Allen froze, his eyes darting wildly. He was trapped. As they approached, the tension in the air became palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the confrontation they had both anticipated. "What do you want?" Allen sneered, trying to regain control. "You can't prove anything." "We found the knife, Arthur," Thompson replied, his voice firm. "This ends now." In a desperate attempt to escape, Allen lunged forward, but the detectives were ready. They tackled him to the ground, the struggle echoing through the woods as they fought to restrain him. As they apprehended him, the realization of what they had uncovered began to sink in. Allen was not merely a suspect. He was a man unraveling, his psyche exposed by the pressure of the investigation. Once back at the station, the weight of the evidence bore down on them. The knife was analyzed, and blood tests confirmed it was linked to the crime scene of David and Betty. Mark, still reeling from the confrontation, returned to the station to find Thompson poring over the evidence. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We have what we need," Thompson replied, looking up. "But the damage has been done. This will take time to heal." As news broke of Allen's arrest, a collective sigh of relief washed over Benicia. Memorials grew larger, and the community began to come together to mourn David and Betty properly. The shadows that had once loomed over their town began to lift, but the scars remained. Mark stood at the memorial, surrounded by friends and family. They lit candles, the flickering flame symbolizing hope amidst the darkness. The pain of loss would never fade, but they were united in their resolve to remember those who had been taken too soon. The case may have found a resolution, but the memories of that fateful night lingered in the hearts of the townspeople. They would forever carry the weight of what had happened, but they would also cherish the strength they found in one another. The arrest of Arthur Allen sent shockwaves through Benicia, but the path to justice was far from straightforward. As the trial approached, the community braced itself for the revelations that would follow. The air was thick with anxiety, and the once united front of the townsfolk began to fracture again, this time along the lines of belief and disbelief. Mark found himself drawn into the center of the storm. As a key witness, he had to testify against Allen. The thought of facing the man who had haunted his dreams filled him with dread. He spent sleepless nights rehearsing what he would say, the fear of inadequacy gnawing at him. The day of the trial arrived, bright and crisp. As Mark walked into the courthouse, he was struck by the sheer weight of the moment. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, spectators, and the families of the victims, all seeking answers. He felt a mixture of anger and sorrow in the air. Thompson, who had become a mentor to Mark throughout the investigation, sat beside him. "You're going to do great," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. Inside the courtroom, tension hung like a thick fog. Arthur Allen sat at the defendant's table, a smirk plastered on his face as he glanced at Mark. The sight of him sent a surge of anger through Mark, but he steeled himself. The prosecution presented its case methodically, revealing the chilling evidence: the blood-stained knife, the journal filled with Allen's disturbing thoughts, and testimonies from other witnesses who had seen him near the crime scenes. As each piece of evidence was unveiled, the atmosphere shifted. Gasps filled the room when the photographs of David and Betty were displayed. Mark took a deep breath as he prepared to take the stand. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he stepped forward, every eye in the room fixed on him. He recounted the events leading up to their deaths, describing the fear that had gripped the town and his own personal nightmares. Allen's defense attorney was a seasoned strategist, skilled in manipulating perceptions. He attempted to dismantle Mark's testimony, questioning his credibility and insinuating that Mark's fears were unfounded. "How can we trust the testimony of someone who is merely a witness in the shadows?" the attorney sneered. Mark felt his confidence waver under the scrutiny, but Thompson's encouraging nod from the back of the courtroom steadied him. "You know what you saw," he reminded himself. "Did you see Arthur Allen commit the murders?" the attorney pressed. "I didn't see him do it," Mark replied, swallowing hard. "But I saw him in the area, and I felt his presence. It was terrifying." The trial dragged on, with witness after witness providing damning evidence against Allen. But as the prosecution built its case, a twist emerged. An unexpected witness came forward, claiming to have seen someone else near the scene. The name was familiar to everyone in the room: John Meyer, a local man with a troubled past. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he took notes. John was someone who had been in and out of trouble, but had never been connected to the murders. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was a diversion orchestrated by Allen's defense to confuse the jury. "Do you know where John Meyer was on the nights of the murders?" Thompson whispered to Mark as they watched the defense attorney's calculated maneuvers. "No," Mark replied, "but we need to find out." As the trial continued, Mark, Thompson, and Sarah took it upon themselves to investigate John Meyer. They discovered that John had a long history of mental health issues, and his alibi for the nights of the murders was shaky at best. The closer they looked, the more questions arose. Mark felt a sense of urgency. If they could find evidence that connected John to the murders, it could shift the trial back in favor of the prosecution. But where would they start? They decided to visit John's last known address, an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The building looked rundown, with peeling paint and graffiti marking the walls. They climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor and knocked on his door. "Who is it?" a voice called from within, laced with unease. "It's Thompson and Mark," Thompson replied. "We want to talk to you about the trial." After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a disheveled man in his 30s. John's eyes darted nervously as he glanced between them. "What do you want? Can we come in?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice calm. John hesitated but stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The room was cluttered with empty bottles and crumpled papers. The stench of unwashed clothes filled the air, and Mark felt a wave of sympathy mixed with apprehension. "Look, I don't want any trouble," John said, running a hand through his hair. "I just want to be left alone." "John, we need to know where you were on the nights of the murders," Thompson pressed gently. "This is serious." "I was around," John mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "But I didn't do anything. I swear." "Did you see anything unusual?" Mark asked, trying to break through the man's defenses. John shifted uncomfortably. I heard things. People talking late at night. Sometimes I saw shadows moving outside. Did you see Arthur Allen?" Mark pressed. John's eyes widened momentarily before he regained his composure. "I don't want to get involved, man. That guy's bad news." Despite John's reluctance to speak, Mark felt there was something deeper at play. "We're not here to hurt you, John. We want the truth. If you know something, now's the time to say it." With a sigh, John slumped down onto a worn-out couch, his head in his hands. "Fine. I saw Alan that night, but I didn't think much of it. He was acting weird, talking to himself. I thought he was just drunk or something." Mark felt a surge of hope. "Where did you see him?" "By the quarry," John replied, looking defeated. "He was near the old shack." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Thompson asked, concern etched on his face. "Because I didn't want to be involved. I thought they'd think I was guilty too," John admitted, his voice trembling. "But now I see how serious this is." With this new information, Mark and Thompson rushed back to the courthouse, ready to present their findings. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and they needed to act fast. As they arrived, they found the courtroom buzzing with anticipation. The defense was preparing to deliver its closing arguments, and Thompson quickly whispered to the prosecution's lead attorney about what they had discovered. "Your Honor," Thompson called out, stepping forward as the judge was about to allow the closing arguments. "We have new evidence that could change the course of this trial." The courtroom fell silent as everyone turned to listen. "Objection," Allen's attorney shouted, but the judge raised a hand for silence. "What do you have?" the judge asked, his expression stern. Thompson took a deep breath. "We have a witness who saw Arthur Allen at the quarry the night of the murders." John Meyer was brought in to testify, and as he took the stand, Mark felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. John looked disheveled but determined, his voice shaking as he recounted the night he had seen Allen. He was talking to himself, looking off. John recalled, glancing nervously at Allen. "I thought he was just drunk. but now I know. As John continued to testify, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. The defense attempted to discredit him, but the jury was captivated by the raw honesty in his voice. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Alan's attorney pressed. "Because I was scared," John replied, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to be next." After days of emotional testimonies, the jury finally deliberated. Mark sat in the courtroom, heart pounding as he awaited the decision. The weight of uncertainty loomed heavily in the air, and the tension was palpable. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The foreman stood, holding the paper with the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Arthur Allen, guilty of the murders of David and Betty." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Relief, anger, and sorrow intertwined as the families of the victims broke down in tears. Mark felt a burden lift from his shoulders, but he also knew the scars would remain. In the months that followed, the community began to heal. Memorials were held in honor of David and Betty, and the residents of Benicia united in their resolve to support one another. Mark found solace in connecting with those who had been affected by the tragedy. He attended support groups and shared his experiences, helping others find their voices amid the pain. Thompson became a mentor to Mark, guiding him through the complexities of grief and recovery. "You've done a great service to this community," Thompson said one evening over coffee. "You're stronger than you know." As the seasons changed, Mark began to see a path forward. He started volunteering at the local community center, where he organized workshops focused on mental health and healing. It became a space for people to share their stories, and Mark found comfort in helping others. One evening, as he shared his own journey, he noticed a glimmer of hope in the faces of those around him. They were learning to confront their fears together, to stand in the light of truth. But as Mark continued to find his footing, he also faced the shadows of the past. He began having nightmares again, vivid images of the night he had witnessed the horrors unfold. Determined to confront his fears, he sought therapy, where he learned to process his trauma. It wasn't easy, but with each session, he found the piece of himself that he thought he had lost. During one particularly intense session, he shared the details of that night with his therapist, allowing himself to feel the fear he had bottled up for so long. "It was like I was trapped in a nightmare," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't do anything to save them." "You're not trapped anymore, Mark," his therapist said gently. "You're here, and you're taking steps to heal." With time, Mark discovered that healing wasn't a linear journey. There were ups and downs, but the support of his friends and community made all the difference. Together, they participated in community events, fostering a sense of togetherness that had been missing for too long. One night, as they gathered around a bonfire to remember the victims, Mark felt the warmth of their unity enveloping him. "We're stronger together," he spoke, looking around at the faces of those who had stood by him through it all. As they shared stories and laughter, Mark realized that they had begun to create new memories, ones that honored the past while paving the way for a brighter future. Months later, as Mark stood on the edge of the quarry once more, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The darkness of that night still lingered, but it was no longer a suffocating weight. Instead, it served as a reminder of the resilience that had emerged from tragedy. He had learned to embrace the shadows, knowing they were part of his journey. The scars would always be there, but they were also a testament to his strength and the bonds forged in the aftermath. As he gazed out at the water, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The community of Benicia had faced unimaginable pain, yet they had emerged stronger. They would continue to honor the memories of David and Betty by cherishing the love and support they found in one another. With each passing day, Mark embraced life more fully. He began writing about his experiences, pouring his heart into a memoir that chronicled the journey of healing and hope. It became a cathartic release, allowing him to reflect on the lessons learned and the strength gained. The book resonated with many, touching the hearts of those who had experienced similar traumas. Mark received letters from readers expressing gratitude for his honesty and vulnerability, and it inspired him to speak publicly about his journey. As Mark continued to share his story, the community rallied around him. They organized events focused on mental health awareness, encouraging open discussions about grief and healing. The town transformed into a beacon of hope, with people coming together to support one another. The shadows that once loomed over Benicia now served as a reminder of the strength that comes from facing adversity together. Years later, as Mark stood in front of a crowd sharing his story, he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had turned his pain into purpose, using his voice to inspire others to embrace their journeys. The memory of David and Betty remained etched in his heart, but instead of sorrow, he felt gratitude for the lessons learned and the connections forged. Mark's journey had taught him that while the past may cast shadows, it also illuminates the path ahead. With each step, he honored those lost while embracing the light of hope that shone brightly within the community of Benicia. As spring arrived in Benicia, the community felt a renewed energy. Festivals bloomed, and laughter echoed through the streets. But beneath the surface, the scars of the past still haunted many. Mark, now a prominent figure in mental health advocacy, sensed a shift in the air, a foreboding feeling that something was amiss. One evening, while hosting a support group at the community center, Mark noticed a newcomer. A man sat quietly in the corner, his face shadowed by the dim light. As the meeting progressed, Mark's instinct told him to keep an eye on this stranger. After the group ended, the man approached Mark. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and shaky. "Of course," Mark replied, leading him to a quieter area. "What's on your mind?" "I heard about what happened here with the quarry." The man hesitated, as if grappling with the weight of his words. "I was there that night." Mark's heart raced. "You were there?" he asked, leaning in closer. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "I didn't want to relive it," the man replied, his eyes haunted. "But the nightmares, they won't stop. I thought maybe talking would help." Mark nodded, feeling a chill creep up his spine. "You're not alone. We can work through this together." As they talked, the man revealed his name, Jacob. He described the night of the tragedy in vivid detail, recounting the fear and chaos that erupted. "I saw things I wish I could forget," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an accident. There was something more." Intrigued yet concerned, Mark pressed further. "What do you mean?" Jacob glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. "I saw someone that night. A figure lurking in the shadows, watching. I thought I was just imagining it, but it felt real." The weight of Jacob's words settled heavily in Mark's chest. He recalled the stories of unsolved mysteries surrounding Benicia, the whispers of a figure haunting the town, a connection to the tragedy. "I think we need to investigate," Mark said decisively. "If there's a chance of finding answers, we owe it to the victims." The following week, Mark gathered a small group of trusted friends and fellow advocates. Thompson, who had always been a pillar of support, Sarah, a local journalist passionate about uncovering the truth, and Jacob, who reluctantly agreed to share what he knew. As they delved deeper into the past, they uncovered unsettling connections. Missing persons reports from years prior, odd occurrences around the quarry, and rumors of a cult that once thrived in the shadows of Benicia. Each revelation sent shivers down their spines. One night, they met at Mark's house to share their findings. "There's a pattern here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "These incidents seem connected. We might be looking at something bigger than we thought." Thompson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What if that figure Jacob saw is connected to all of this? If they're still out there, we need to be careful." Despite the fear gripping them, the group decided to investigate the quarry one last time. Equipped with flashlights and a camera, they set out under the cover of darkness, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As they approached the edge of the water, an unsettling silence enveloped them. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken horrors. "This is where it happened," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "I can still hear there." Screams. Mark placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "We're here to find the truth. Together." As they combed through the area, they discovered remnants of a fire pit, surrounded by darkened stones. Someone was here, Sarah noted, snapping photos. This hasn't been disturbed in a while. Suddenly, a rustling sound shattered the silence. The group froze, their breath hitching in their throats. "Did you hear that?" Thompson whispered, eyes wide. Before anyone could respond, a shadow darted between the trees. Heart pounding, Mark shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. Without thinking, Mark and Jacob sprinted after the figure, adrenaline surging through their veins. "Stop!" Mark called out, but the figure moved with unnerving speed, disappearing into the underbrush. The group followed, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. "This way," Jacob shouted, leading them deeper into the woods. But as they ran, Mark felt a growing sense of dread. They were venturing into a labyrinth of shadows, far from the safety of the light. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into a clearing, breathless and disoriented. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. This was part of the old cult's territory. Jacob replied, fear lacing his words. "I've heard stories about rituals that took place here." Deciding they had to confront whatever lay within, Mark led the group to the cabin. Pushing the creaking door open, they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. They found remnants of old newspapers pinned to the walls, articles about the missing persons and unsolved crimes that had haunted Benicia for decades. "It's all connected," Mark murmured, piecing together the narrative. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. Panic rose within the group. "What's happening?" Sarah shouted, her voice laced with fear. "Stay calm," Mark urged, fumbling for his flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing the outline of a figure standing in the corner, watching. "I knew you'd come," a raspy voice echoed, sending chills down their spines. "You've meddled in things you don't understand." As the figure stepped into the light, they were met with a face Mark recognized, a man from town who had always kept to himself. You're the one behind it all?" Mark gasped, disbelief flooding him. The man smiled, a twisted expression. You were never meant to know the truth. The quarry holds power, and I was chosen to guard it. Guard it from what? Thompson demanded, fists clenched. You've terrorized this community for too long. The darkness must be fed, the man said, his eyes gleaming with madness. I offered sacrifices to keep it at bay. You all have stirred something that should have remained buried. In a split second, the atmosphere shifted. The group lunged at the man, but he was surprisingly strong, pushing Mark back. You don't understand, he yelled, scrambling for the door. The group fought to restrain him, grappling in the dim light. Mark felt a surge of determination. They couldn't let him escape. With one final push, they brought him to the ground, securing his arms behind him. You won't get away with this, Jacob said, breathing heavily. We'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Once they had secured the man, they called the police. As the authorities arrived, they revealed the truth about the sacrifices and the terror that had plagued Benicia for far too long. With the man in custody, Mark and his friends felt a wave of relief wash over them. The shadows that had loomed over their town were beginning to lift, but the scars remained. In the following weeks, the community came together to heal. Mark organized a memorial for the victims, a chance for everyone to honor those lost and acknowledge the pain they had endured. As they gathered at the quarry, surrounded by flowers and candles, Mark spoke about resilience and the importance of facing their fears. We are not defined by our darkness, but by how we rise from it, he declared, his voice steady. With tears in their eyes, the community stood united, ready to forge a brighter future. In the months that followed, Mark continued his advocacy work, focusing on mental health awareness and community support. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over him. He found solace in sharing his story, helping others navigate their own journeys of healing. With each workshop and event, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to turn pain into empowerment. Years later, as Mark walked through the revitalized streets of Benicia, he felt a sense of peace. The town had transformed, embracing a spirit of resilience and hope. Standing at the edge of the quarry, he looked out at the water, shimmering under the sun. The memories of that fateful night would always be a part of him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had propelled him toward a brighter tomorrow. In that moment, he understood the power of community, the strength of truth, and the importance of facing the shadows head-on. And as he turned to leave, Mark knew that together, they had triumphed over the darkness.